Hello. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Adrienne Clarkson, as you know, and I am also the adopted Chief Gosoni of the Blood Tribe of Alberta. I acknowledge that in Toronto, where I am sitting, we are in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, and all of us newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm so glad that you've all joined us today for the 5th time that the Adrienne Clarkson Prize for Global Citizenship is given. And this year, I'm thrilled, delighted that we are able to welcome Murray Sinclair, lawyer, judge, senator, who is here with us to receive the prize.
Hello, Adrienne. Thank you very much.
Welcome, Murray. I'm so looking forward to chatting with you after I tell people why it is that you're getting this prize. Murray Sinclair is Ojibwe from Manitoba, and he was raised on the former St. Peter's Reserve in the Selkirk area north of Winnipeg. And like many outstanding people, he showed his promise very early. In high school, he was Athlete of the Year at Selkirk Collegiate in 1968 and class valedictorian. His university studies or further studies were interrupted because he had to leave to take care of his grandmother, who wasn't well. But he had to earn a living, and at 21, he became executive assistant to Howard Pauley, the Attorney General of Manitoba. And then 4 years later, when he returned to university, he studied law, graduated, and was awarded the A.J. Christie Prize as the top student in litigation. His involvement with the military began when he was a teenage air cadet, and he continued his involvement as an air instructor with the Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron. His career as a lawyer saw him representing First Nations of Manitoba in the areas of land claims, funding negotiations, and child welfare agreements. When he was appointed in 1988 as Associate Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of Manitoba, he became the first Aboriginal judge in the province. And in 2001, he was the first Indigenous person to be appointed to the Queen's Bench of Manitoba. For decades, Murray Sinclair has been a powerful voice leading the way for fundamental change in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. His passion, intellect, and commitment have caused more and more people to turn to him on this and on so many other subjects. As chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he tirelessly, ceaselessly laid out meticulously for us what Canada and Canadians need to do in order to deal with the damages, the wrongs, and injustices which have festered and harmed so many people.
To know truth, we must begin by telling it.
Carrying out the recommendations of the TRC could help us to expunge the stain that has immobilized us as a society. In 2016, he accepted to be appointed to the Senate. Whether as judge, commissioner, or senator, or simply as an engaged human being, he has marked and changed our society. It's my pleasure to be able to give you this medal, which is created by the wonderful Canadian sculptor Anna Williams. I hope you'll enjoy having it on your mantelpiece.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful honor that you bestowed upon me. I really appreciate that. I was reflecting in contemplating the honor that you've given me on the question of citizenship and what it means and what it's meant to me over the years. It's not very often that we really think about it. particularly those that have been born in the state of impoverishment that my family, my community comes from, and with the state of colonial oppression that we've all experienced. What does it mean to be part of Canada? And what does it mean to be a citizen of the world? I really appreciate this honor because it causes me to reflect upon the fact that there are different roles that we all play in life, different obligations that we all undertake. But first and foremost, I think our primary obligation and primary responsibility is to do what we can to make our society better. And we do that through the many small things that we do, by being a good person, by being a good student, by being a successful worker in whatever it is that we do, whether it's in a law in my case, or whether it's a teacher or a social worker, or whatever it is that we're called upon to do. I think that we're all impelled to do it the best way that we can. It was one of the pieces of advice that I was given by an Indigenous elder back early on in my legal career, when I was particularly frustrated by the treatment of Indigenous people by the court system, including me. Sometimes judges would seem to belittle me and the arguments that I was trying to present. And sometimes, in fact, I was actually mistaken for an accused person and not given the automatic respect that other lawyers are being given in the courtroom. And at that point in time, when I was thinking about maybe this was the wrong career for me, I did go and speak to an elder, and the one thing he did tell me was that we all have a responsibility to be the best person that we can be. He said, you don't have to be a lawyer to do that. You can be a carpenter, which was my second choice of careers, as a matter of fact, because my grandfather, who raised me, was a carpenter. Or you could be a mechanic, or you can be a laborer. But whatever it is that you do, you have to do it the best way that you can. And you have to ensure that in doing that, that you are also a good husband, you're a good father, you're a good brother to your sisters and your brothers, you're a good grandfather when you have grandchildren, you're a good neighbor, and you help the people whenever you can help them. And so that responsibility was reinforced for me by that man who's long left us now, but I always think of his words. And I pay homage to him often in my thoughts and my prayers. His name was Angus Merrick. He was from the Log Plain First Nation. And Angus proved to be a good friend to me over the years as I was practicing law, and in my years as a judge as well before he left us. And his presence always reinforced that principle for me, that we have a responsibility to do what we can. In my work, particularly because of my work as a political activist and a social activist when I was younger, I was inclined to advocate only for Indigenous principles and Indigenous issues, and to take action against policies and governments and things that I disagreed with, because I felt they continued to oppress Indigenous people. But the one thing I learned early on, and it became part of the mantra that we used in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and people who have heard me speak over the years will recall that I often say that when the government of Canada set out to oppress Indigenous people and to do away with their rights and to do away with their culture and to do away with their language and to forcibly remove them from the memory of Canadian society, they were depriving Canada of a great gift. They were depriving all Canadians of the opportunity to know what was unique about this country, about this place, and that it wasn't just Indigenous people who suffered at the hands of government. In a different way, Canadians generally also suffered a loss. They lost the opportunity to be friends. They lost the opportunity to really know Indigenous people, to know them as friends, to know them as neighbors, to engage with them. And I've always felt that that loss cut both ways, and we needed to do something about that. And in the work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and afterwards, I've always said that the one thing that we need to understand is that reconciliation is not simply about getting past this. Reconciliation is about rebuilding our relationship and rebuilding it in a way where we can truly have respect for each other, because in the long term, it's our children and our grandchildren and their children who are going to have to live with the impact of this history, the impact of these policies, these laws, and whatever it is that we do today. We need to contribute to their being able to have a better relationship, a more understanding relationship, a more knowledgeable relationship than people in this country to this point in time have been able to have. When I speak with members of the public, particularly non-Indigenous people, about what the government did in establishing and running residential schools and establishing as well laws that took away Indigenous rights, the right to vote, the right to go to court, the right to assemble, the right to even leave their community and travel freely, the right to sell their produce from the gardens that they maintained or from the farms that they had. When I tell people about that, they feel a sense of shame and a sense of anger about it. But I said, that's not productive. What you need to do is you just need to understand that that's why we have this situation that we have. That's why people don't have respect for Indigenous people. That's why people in Canada don't understand what it is that Indigenous people are asking for, and don't have faith that what they're asking for is worth giving. And I said, if you had a 5-year-old child who was taken away from you by the government against your will, without any reason other than the fact that they wanted to turn your child into somebody who was different than you, how would you feel? What would you think? Would you not think that was wrong? Would you not want something done about that? Would you not recognize that in the long term that's going to hurt not just the child, but hurt that child's relationship with the rest of the world? And so my ambition with the work that I have done over the years, it has evolved, I'll grant you that, from being a political advocate and a social activist in the past, to being a legal advocate as part of my career, and to becoming a judge, is to show Canadians that they can have a better understanding of this country, to show Canadians that they can be better citizens than the previous generations of citizenry in this country have been, that they can be more responsible, that they can, in fact, contribute to the dream that this country is founded upon, which is a place of solace, a place of better life for all of us. But in order for us to do that, we have to know this history. We have to understand why things are the way they are and how they have evolved over the years. And that's what reconciliation means to me. And that's how much I believe in it, because I have grandchildren and I don't want them growing up feeling that other people see them as inferior people, because they're not. I have daughters who have master's degree. I have a son who's got a PhD, and they're very accomplished people. But I know that when they go into a store, they get followed by the security people who think that they're going to steal something just because they're Indigenous. And that's not right. It's not fair. And my hope and ambition is that they will be able to get past that and use that as an opportunity to educate the rest of society that these things need to change. And we have a long way to go. It took us from 1867, from the time of Confederation, through many, many leaders and many, many governments and many, many laws to get to this point in time. It took 7 generations of children going through residential schools in order for the damage to those families that were affected by the schools to occur. And it's probably going to take us generations before we can say that we are in a better position, in a more respectful position. And one of the reasons for that is that we have to make an effort to ensure that Indigenous people gain back their self-respect. We spend so much time denigrating Indigenous culture, Indigenous history, Indigenous languages, Indigenous rights, that we fail to see that it has had a negative impact upon their sense of self. That's why we have such high suicide rates. We have such high addiction rates. We have such high dropout rates in our schools among young Indigenous people. It's because they've not only lost hope and faith in this existing system, but they've lost hope and faith in life generally. They don't believe that that they can succeed despite the contributions of others in terms of what others are doing to them. They don't believe that they have the ability to do so because they think that others are going to constantly hold them back. And they don't see society as supporting them. And we need to turn all of that around. So it'll take generations for us to do that, but it'll take generations of concerted effort. We can't simply wait it out. Because if we wait it out, then we will be playing into the hands of those who will try to take advantage of it to make the situation worse. And that would not be good. That would not be the right thing to do. We have to be assertive, we have to be positive, and we have to work hard. And I accept this gift on behalf of all of those people who believe that along with me, including my fellow commissioners, Willie Littlechild and Marie Wilson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all of the staff who worked with me, and all of the people over the years who have come to see that reconciliation is something that we need to achieve, and it is achievable. So I thank you again for this honor, and on behalf of all of those people and those principles, I accept it gladly.
I'm so glad that you have accepted it, Murray. Your life and the work that you have done are an inspiration, but also I can't help but wonder, why don't you lose patience? Why don't you say, this has gone on, you say, for 7 generations. You, in your own family, descended from people who were in residential schools. I think your grandmother, your parents. And why does that bitterness not overtake you? What gave you the strength to say, I'm going to do something about this? And you must have known it quite young, because when you start in high school and you become a top athlete and you become the valedictorian, something must have been there that said, I can do this, and I can do this because I need to do this, not only for myself, but for the others.
Well, you have to have someone who believes in you, and in order for that strength that they share with you in doing that, to be able to get through those hard moments. And there are hard moments, there's no question of that. And when I was young, as I said earlier, I was raised by my grandparents, and which is why I was so devoted to them in their later years. And it was my grandmother who was the most influential person in my life. And she was the one who first told me that if I were to go to university, that I must understand that I have a responsibility to use that education to benefit others and not just to benefit me. And I have tried to do that. I have worked hard to do that. And then over the years, others have also reinforced that principle for me. And I do get frustrated. There's no question of that. And I do have moments, but I have learned from elders how to address that through ceremony, through discussion with them, and also with children. I want you to know that my greatest source of strength comes when I talk to children, because they are so helpful to me to make me believe, to help me believe that they are the ones that this is all worthwhile doing for.
Your Ojibwe name is Mirzana Gizik, one who speaks of pictures in the sky, and yet you've done so many things here on Earth. How do the pictures of the sky in your name help you with that?
Well, it reminds me that, and the story of the name is very important. So understanding the name is one thing, but the story talks about when I was given that name. It was in a ceremony, and the elder who gave me the name said, "This is a story of a young man, who saw how difficult life was for his people, and he was trying to figure out how he could help them. And so in order to find the answer, he went out into a high place and he sat upon his mother, the earth, and he asked the Creator to show me what it is that I have to do in order to help the people." And he sat there for days and days waiting to be shown the answer. And he was getting frustrated, and he was getting angry at the Creator because he couldn't see the answers, and he couldn't hear the words that he was waiting to hear. And finally, they say a little vole popped up out of the ground and said to him, "What are you here for?" And when the young man explained to the vole what it was that he was there for, and this is all told in the language, incidentally, so it's quite a beautiful story. When he told the vole why he was there, the vole said, "You know, you're an idiot, that because all of the answers you've been seeking are up there. The Creator's been showing you all the time. You just don't know how to read those words that he's giving you." And so what it is to learn the patience to look for the answers in the right way, and to find that the answers really often come from within you. So, I like to tell the story of my naming, but I also remind myself of what it is that I have to do too.
To live up to it?
Well, to live up to it, but also to take time out from time to time to reconnoiter with the environment, with creation, to ask the Creator to remind me whether I'm doing the right thing. Yes.
And does he tell you?
All the time. Yeah, he's not afraid to talk to me. So sometimes I'm afraid to hear what he has to say, but it is the language of the land is really strong for me, because I can feel it. I feel the land when it hurts. I feel what's going on around me with creation, but I also hear the people. I hear the voices of the people, and those are, some would say those are in dreams, and I accept that. But I can hear that in the same way, and they help me, because I try to figure it out. I try to sort it all out for myself, and it really is an important process. Just to go through the exercise would be a worthwhile process, but then to come out of it feeling that you've achieved some knowledge is really, really what it's all about.
As an Indigenous lawyer and judge, of course, you did a number of things that are, and culminating in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, were for Indigenous people. But you did an inquiry which actually captured my interest when I read about it. I had not known about it, into the deaths of 12 babies in a Winnipeg hospital, and that was an inquiry that you led. And I assume that those were babies who were not just Indigenous, they may have been some, but that it also took a great toll on you, that you hesitated to take the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on because you were still dealing with what that had brought up to you. Can you tell me about that? What that meant to you as an inquiry, and how you were touched by it?
Well, I don't think as a parent you ever can figure out how to help somebody who has lost a child. When someone loses a child, you immediately revert back to your own relationship with your children and ask yourself, well, how would I feel if it was one of my children who had suffered this? And looking into the deaths of 12 babies who died during the course of a pediatric cardiac surgery program, and whose deaths were largely attributable to error, medical error, was really quite challenging emotionally. Constantly, every day, I would have to go to work. I'd have to go into the courtroom. I'd have to listen to the evidence of experts. I'd have to listen to the experts talk about, kind of mechanically and scientifically what had gone wrong. But then I'd have to listen to the parents talk about what they lost and how they have never gotten over it, really. And that was a constant reminder to myself as to what it was that I would have to face if that were ever to happen to me. And it was that part of it was the most difficult. And on top of that, of course, was the fact that the people who were involved in that, the people who surrounded each event, the nurses in particular, who had to be part of a program that they didn't believe in, that they thought it was dangerous to send children into that program, to have them operated on by this particular surgeon because they didn't think the surgeon had the necessary skills and aptitude to successfully do the operations. So for those nurses, it also took a huge toll on them, and I really felt their loss and their sense of frustration as well, because they worked within a bureaucracy. They worked within an institution that didn't give them much room, much latitude to be able to do anything about it. And so that was also particularly galling for them. The report itself has had a dramatic impact, I'm told, on the medical community. It's one of the most significant reports I've been told from time to time on the issue of medical error in Canada. And so I think in that sense, it was a success. It achieved a certain degree of utility. But when it was all over, I was emotionally exhausted. My wife would tell you that I would come home at the end of the day, having listened to the testimony of a child dying, and the impact that death had upon the various people in the child's life or in the treatment team that were trying to save her life, and I would go for hours just sitting quietly outside because I couldn't come in. I couldn't. I couldn't handle having young children around me, so it was very, very difficult. And then I knew that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process was going to be equally difficult, mind you, with older people, but it was going to be about children and what had happened to children. And so when I was first asked if I would do the TRC, I said, no, I can't. I'm just emotionally still coming to terms with what happened to me during the pediatric cardiac surgery inquiry. And so I turned it down, and Tom Berger at the time was the the chair of the selection committee. And he understood. He absolutely understood how I was feeling, and I really appreciated that. He didn't push me at all, and they went ahead and selected another group. But when that group failed to achieve what it was supposed to achieve, it failed to even get off the ground. And I was asked a second time if I would step in and take it on. I realized at that point in time that there was a real need on the part of the survivors of residential schools to have someone come along who understood and could understand what it was that they had experienced, and would be able to identify with their community. And I had come from a family in which every one of my aunties and uncles had gone to a residential school. My father had gone to a residential school. My grandparents had gone to residential schools. There were residential schools nearby where I grew up. So I had some idea of what all of this meant. And on top of all that, I was, I think, emotionally a little better prepared for it. But I also learned through talking with the elders and spiritual advisors how to cope with all of that pain. And I brought that those lessons from that inquiry to the commissioners and to the staff at the TRC, because of what I learned at the pediatric cardiac surgery inquiry was never to go through this alone. And don't allow yourself to experience it alone. Always surround yourself with people who will help you and will know and will learn how to recognize the signs that you need their help, even if you can't articulate it. So with the commissioners, for example, I warned them, you're going to hear some very difficult stories. And so I want you to find a spiritual advisor. So somebody, if you're a member of a church, and somebody from your church who will be able to be with you. I want you to have a mental health support worker who will be able to address any mental health issues that this may raise for you. And then I want you also to have a medical advisor, somebody who will monitor your health as we're going forward, because the one thing that I know could happen is that the emotional toll can have an impact upon our health. And so each of the commissioners had a team of 3 people, a spiritual advisor, mental health advisor, and a medical advisor, who worked with them constantly throughout the process. And we put together medical teams for our senior staff as well, who were working with the survivors, and made sure that they had those supports. Because that was probably the one thing during the pediatric cardiac surgery inquiry that I didn't do, and suffered as a result of it. And so I learned that going forward, we needed to have that in place. And at the end of the day, I still run into some of the families whose babies died during the pediatric inquiry, and I ran into some of the nurses who were part of the process, and they still thank me for the way that we did the inquiry and gave them so much space and so much time to talk about how they were feeling and what they were doing and going through. And so I think we ended up perhaps even unconsciously doing the right thing. But now that we know better, then we know how to do this. And I would impart that knowledge, that experience to any other inquiry that was getting into the same field. But it was probably the most difficult thing I've ever done.
But you brought the lessons of that into the TRC, and I think that it shows. It shows in the way in which you came to the 90-odd resolutions, the kind of spiritual, moral attitude of the TRC has been felt by people, even though they didn't know the details of it. So much of what happens in our lives we don't really understand, and especially if they come out of governmental type inquiries or so on. We only get the results. We look, we number them. We say, what happened to number 58? What happened to number 53? But I think the health of the recommendations, and I use that as health, is that you all were able to be whole while you were dealing with this incredibly sad, tragic, almost unbearable material. And I think that's the way a lot of Canadians look at it. They say, oh, we know that happened in those schools, but we really don't want to know about the details. We don't want to know what happened. And I think what you've been able to do is to show that to people, to help people. And that is a kind of healing for the rest of Canada, for the people who did not go through that system. Does that make you feel that you have done something for us?
Yeah, I remember early on at the TRC, we were asking ourselves the question, how can we get Canada to care about this? How can we get them to really care? And my answer to that was, let's show them the humanity of the people who are there. Let's bring that right to their TV living room environment so that they can't just look away. They can't just close their eyes, that this will be something that they will actually see and hear. And that was the key, was to bring it into the homes of non-Indigenous people, to help them to see that this was real and that this happened to real people. And this happened to innocent people, people who didn't ask for it, people who are living with the consequences of it and are struggling to do the best that they can despite all of this. And I think we accomplished that. I think we gave to people in this country, reasonable people of this country, the ammunition, the information, the ability to be able to do something about it. And we didn't just write it for government. We did, of course, have many recommendations for governments at all levels. We had recommendations for church leaders at all levels, in all of the church groups. But at the end of the day, and you may remember what I said was that we have described for all of Canada a mountain, and we have shown you the way to the top, but now it's for you to do the climbing. Not for the government, it's for you to do the climbing. And so that's what was key, was for us to keep our focus on who the real target audience was, and that was them.
What would indicate to you that we have changed, because it isn't going to be just the government that does implementation, if they do, of a majority of the recommendations, but what to you would show that we as a society in Canadians had really accepted this and were acting on it? What kind of things would you see then?
Well, first of all, I see it in the media. I see the way that the media now picks up on some of these stories and some of this information and makes the connections and connects the dots and often brings it back to a history of colonial oppression or colonialism or whatever the terminology is of the moment, but that they now tell a more thorough story. There's still gaps, of course, but I see there is more of a trend there. But more importantly, I think I also see it in the literature, which is really, to me, quite astounding, if I can use the word. I have never read so many books about Indigenous people, Indigenous stories, Indigenous human beings, Indigenous men, Indigenous women, Indigenous communities as I have in the last 5 years. Before that, you could count on on your hands and toes the number of good books that were out there that talked about this, written by Indigenous authors. But now it's in the hundreds, including graphic novels written for the young audience, children's books written for the preschoolers and early schoolers, high school targeted books, university targeted books, and fiction novels and stories that are part of overall stories. And then on top of that, the education system by far has started to really work hard. Teachers and educators have really started to work hard to change the curriculum that's being offered in our schools to be more inclusive. Now, that's being resisted by some elements within the educational community and in the political community who don't want these stories told, who only want a polished version of Canadian history taught. But I think, it's like trying to get the genie back in the bottle, as far as I'm concerned. Now that it's out there, they'll never be able to unsnap that sound. There's too many people out there who know some of this, and I defy any teacher today to talk about the discovery of Canada who isn't challenged by some student to say, yeah, but what about the Indigenous people who were here at the time? What about them? What's their story? Why aren't we talking about that? And I defy any teacher to try to teach about Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered this part of the world, and it was all nice and good, and let's go now. And somebody will stand up and say, but what about the millions of Indigenous people he massacred? So children are well aware now of what it is that they know, and not afraid to share it.
Some provinces are a little farther ahead than others. 10 years ago, I was in a grade 1 classroom in Saskatoon, and the teacher said to the children, who are the treaty people here? And it was a downtown school, so there were a lot of Indigenous children and Métis children, and every child put up its hand. And that was so terrific because treaty made between two parties, right? the settlers and the people who were originally there. And I thought, this is what we need to do. When I went to public school, we did not denigrate in any way Native peoples or Indians, as we then were grade 5 called them, but we were given projects to do and asked to go and get birch bark and little pieces of things and make a model of how the Indians lived. And we learned that from a geography book, etc. Nobody ever said to us, 40 miles from here in Ottawa is the Maniwaki Reserve where the Algonquin live. We didn't ever see a native, an Indigenous person. No one ever said they were alive. We studied them like the Greeks and Romans, as though the civilization were gone and dead and had been squelched. And so my whole lifetime has been spent discovering the richness of that, and understanding that we have so far to go. But what you've done with the TRC has helped us enormously. But is it going to help us with systemic racism, which is not just against Indigenous people, but against others? There's the whole idea of systemic racism is now something that hits us right in the face and that we have to deal with.
Well, one of the first things that we have to do is we have to get people to understand what systemic racism is, and that's part of the difficulty, is that we've never really talked about it as a concept. And when we do talk about it, sometimes we're talking about it in different ways. I did an inquiry into the Thunder Bay Police Force and raised the question of systemic racism. And it was clear to me that the people who are responding from the police side of things in Thunder Bay believed that systemic racism was when you had a system where every single person in the system was a racist. And that's not what systemic racism is at all. Systemic racism is when you have a system that is founded upon policies and practices and legislation that is inherently biased in favor of another group, usually the dominant, more powerful group in society, and that it has a negative impact upon the rest of society or upon a particular group in society. And so the difference between systemic racism and racism per se, I tell people, is that racists are acting out of intention. Systemic racists are not acting out of intention at all, but they are having the same negative impact. So one is about intention, the other is about impact. And it's when we continue to have that impact that we need to understand that we have to do something. So the reality is that we still have a long way to go just to understand what systemic racism is. But I do believe that even going back to the work that we did with the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in 1991, that we made a contribution to that discussion at that time. But that discussion now is being advanced even further by the dialogue that's going on in North America today, and getting people to understand that it's about impact or effect versus intention is really a significant change, because then you can have a more reasonable conversation. But you still have to deal with racism. But I keep telling people you can get rid of all the racists in the police force, but you're still going to have a problem, because you're going to have a police force that's still founded upon systemic racism and will still have a negative impact upon the people of color within society, because that's the way that the rules are now and the practices are now directed.
It's very interesting to think of how we could correct what is systemic racism as opposed to racists. And I think your distinction is very important, because systemic racism is the whole structure was based usually on something colonial in something that would be a country like Canada, or on a Eurocentric vision, as it would be for Europe. I've never forgotten a wonderful story that I read, and it just explained to me so much what systemic racism was, which is an interview with Tom Mboyo, who was one of the founders of Kenya, and together with Jomo Kenyatta. And he was by profession a chemist. He had been trained in Britain, and he was working in Britain as a chemist in a lab. And one day he went to the door because somebody knocked on the door, and it was lunchtime, and there wasn't anybody who was at the front of the house. He was working in the lab. He opened the door, and a woman, an English woman, was standing in front of him, and she looked at him and said, "Isn't there anyone here?" To me, that's always been what systemic racism really is about. That nobody exists but who you think are human beings. And he in his white coat from Kenya did not, to her, exist. And if you'd said to her, "You're a racist," she wouldn't have even known what you meant, right? But that's what we need to deal with as societies, is these things that we don't even think of. It's the things that we don't think of that are the most dangerous, as opposed to the things that we are willing to deal with at any point. You've made us more willing to deal with everything by your work and by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm wondering, what is there left to do? What is there for Murray to do? I know that you have now joined a law firm in order to do what? What have you joined a law firm to do? As though being in the Senate and having done all these things wasn't enough for you.
I think that the result of all of the not my work, but the result of all of the changes that have been going on in society has been that there is not just a growing movement, but I think an inevitability to the development of nationhood, development of systems of governance, self-governance within Indigenous communities that is being fed by the fact that we now have more Indigenous graduates than we've ever had before from university, with law degrees, with professional degrees, with professional management training, and who are able to go back to their communities and start helping their communities to develop their own ways of doing things, independent of what the federal government wants them to do and how the federal wants them to do it. One good example of that is the recent Bill C-92, which went through the House of Commons and the Senate before the prorogation of the House, and became the law of the country, which basically says that if Indigenous people want to establish their own child welfare system, they have the right to do so. And they can do so, and no one will be able to challenge their right to do that. And so now we're seeing Indigenous societies, First Nations, Métis, establishing their own child welfare agencies. But at the same time, it also raises the question of, well, what about their own justice systems? And what about their own police forces? And what about their own legal systems generally? What about their own parliamentary systems, their own ways of passing laws? So those questions are big questions. And so they're going to need people who have the kind of legal training that will assist them to develop those in a way that is consistent with basic legal principles, but also consistent with the traditions of the people. And so I've joined the law firm because I have a smattering of knowledge about how I think that can work. So that's part of my ambition right now. But in addition to that, I think one of the major responsibilities I have right now is to get all of this down in writing and to make sure that when I leave, people will be able to say, what did he think about that? And what did he say about that? And they'll have a record of that.
Thank you so much, Murray.
Well, thank you again so much for this terrific honor and for this opportunity to visit with you. I really appreciate that, and to visit with all of the people who've been listening in. This has been a huge success point in my life, and I'll never forget it. So thank you again for including me in this, and I appreciate that.
Don't live by the rules. Wolves don't live by the rules. Wolves don't live by the rules. Wolves don't live by the rules. Valleys to hills, you can hear the cry. They have to fight to stay alive. No one can change it, Mother Nature knows the reason why. Oh, wolves don't live by the rules. Wolves don't live by the rules. They're born to kill and to be free. Their life is hard, which is meant to be. The cry of the wild is the only way they can see. don't live by